Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to Wood by Wright 2. Today we're going to be looking at more of the detail of how to make a spill plane, or in this case, how to mess up at making a spill plane. Now I always feel a bit bad when I have a video that goes out and there are really no problems in it because everything ran fairly smoothly. But that's not reality. And I want people to know that there are problems and they do come along, and that's one of the best ways to learn. So today we're going to be looking at how I messed up making this spill plane. What are things that I can learn and how can I do it better next time? So come along with me today as we work with this Red Rose production kit and trying to make a spill plane. I am going to make another one in the future, but for right now let's learn how not to make one.
Okay, let's get on with this shindig. I'm going to be making this out of a block of elm. This actually ends up being the exact same block that I made the base of my table out of. And I'm going to be making this with a Red Rose production kit. And it comes with a blade and screws, directions, and full-scale prints. So it's a lot of fun. First thing I'm going to do is rip this down to the correct width. And I'm going to be marking it out and then running it down with rip saw, slicing it to the, well, actually not the correct width, the correct height, because the width of the board is what I want. Basically, I want the rings of the tree, I want the bark to be towards the bottom. So if there are rings, it makes a bow facing down. So I'm going to be slicing this down to the correct height of the plane. Once we have that, we can then start surfacing and squaring this whole block up. I'm going to need to square it all down so that it is the correct dimensions, as well as 90 degrees to the sides, 90 degrees to the face. I'm particularly going to be working on the two sides and the top of it. I'm not going to square off the bottom yet because I'm going to be doing more work on that later when we cut the rabbet for the groove to fit. This is a good chance to brush up on your dimensioning skills and make sure that you can bring everything back into true flush, twist-free, and smooth, using winding sticks and straight edges and all of that to make it just perfect. Now, this is going to be a little controversial. I'm cutting out one of the designs so that I can paste it on there and put the holes directly on. You don't have to do that, you can just measure off of things, and I'm probably going to do that with the next one since I already cut it off onto this one. But I like having the visual reference on the board. It just makes it a little easier for me. Now, before cutting the side face off of it, we need to drill the holes through the side face and into the main body. This way they will line up after we cut them off. So I'm going to drill a test piece into this block to make sure that my hole is the correct size so that it doesn't strip out, because the brass screws loosen a little bit or are easily stripped out. Once I have that done, put the flag on to cut to the right depth, and then drill out the 9 holes that connect the side to the main body. The reason that the side comes off is you need to be able to clean out the chips in the body, and it makes it much easier if you can take that off and get at it. So now that we have all of the holes drilled all the way through the side into the body, we can now rip the side off. And so we're going to be cutting off a piece that's a little bit wider than 3/8, so we're planing it down to 3/8-ish. So this is where you want to be decent at resawing. You've got to take your time, you've got to practice, you've got to actually let the saw do the work. Don't force the saws through or it's going to bend. And if you take your time, you'll end up with a nice clean cut. It's not that difficult, it just takes a little bit of patience. Now we can plane this thing down and get the two faces ready to fit together so that they have a nice clean fit between the side and the body. Once that's done, then we can actually start working on cutting out the rabbet. And what this is a groove that runs down the bottom of the sole that the board can fit in. And this will allow it to be easier to control the board so you're not skewing it more than it needs to be. Now I could use a rabbeting plane, I could use a moving philister plane, I could use a rabbet saw, I could use the kerfing plane, but in this case I find it just easier to cut it down. I use the knife wall to then cut at 90 degrees from either side, and then pop, I have that piece that is done. And it's a lot of fun when the piece falls out and you have a nice clean surface. I'll just go at it with a plane maker's float, and that'll just smooth everything out, get rid of all of the saw marks, and I've got a rabbet ready for work. You can see how this kind of fits. Now we want to start working on the mouth of the plane. This is where things start to get a little complicated because you have compound angle cuts that are all different, and it feels really weird, and it's a chore to wrap your brain around it. But if you look at the dimensions and drawings that Red Rose Production provides, it makes it a lot easier. All of the angles and measurements are on there, and you can follow it and get pretty close. I mean, it still takes some skill to do. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not an easy task, but it's very doable. So if you lay out the lines and saw to your lines, it's just like any other cut. Then we can come in with the chisel and clean it all out, smooth it down, and file the surface nice and flush to the rabbet that we made. This is it's a step that is easy to overcomplicate. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's difficult, but it's not incredibly difficult. It's something that most people can do with a little bit of practice. Now we can make sure that it's the right angle for the blade. And I might need to do a little bit of fine tuning to bring the blade exactly where I want it, so it just pokes out nice and evenly all the way across. Now that we have the mouth cut, we can reattach the side. And so for this, we're going to drill a larger pilot hole through all of these, and this will allow the shank of the screw to slide. We want it to be able to slide on the side plate so that the threads don't catch on it. And then we can taper out the top with a chamfer bit so that the heads sit flat. Add a little bit of wax to them, and they go into the holes a lot easier. Just be careful not to strip out the brass. It is a little bit more delicate than steel. Some people do like to use a steel screw ahead of time so that it will cut the threads and then the brass goes in a little bit easier. I find with a little bit of wax, they go pretty well. Next thing we need to do is cut a slight slot on either side of the bed for the iron to fit into, because the iron actually slides into either side of the wall so that the full cutting width of the iron is engaged in the groove that we created. Now here I actually want to create a fake blade, so I'm cutting down a piece of oak that's the same thickness and width as the iron. Just putting it on some double-sided tape on the bench allows me to plane it down to precisely the same thickness of the iron. And the reason I want to do that is so that we can fit the wedge in without having the iron in the way and accidentally hitting the iron with other things we're working on. This first wedge, I decided I wanted to try and make it by cutting it to length and then shaping all the angles. And that was a mistake. Cutting it to length first makes a small piece that is very hard to hold on the bench and ended up causing a lot of issues. I drew out all the angles as the plans provided and got it fairly close, but because it was hard to hold on to this way, it became very difficult to get the accurate lines I was looking for. The plane was always getting in the way and hitting the bench, and it just didn't come together. Eventually, I ended up taking off too much in one spot or another, so that I can no longer add material. The wedge was just sloppy in the cut and would not work. So, oh well, let's get rid of that one and work on the next one. So, word to the wise, don't cut it to length first, wait on that until after. And you'll see that here in a moment when we start on the next one. These first two I'm actually doing out of live oak, a scrap that I got from Tally Ho. So in this one, I'm going to leave it long, and I'm going to flatten one side, and this is my reference side. This is what will bed against the iron. And then I can cut the angles on the top, so the front and back, the two sides of the wedge, those are parallel to each other. So I can lay those out, draw lines down, and then cut down those lines. And this makes it a lot easier to cut it down rather than to plane it down. Once we have that done, then we can cut the wedge angle, which is a compound wedge angle and looks really confusing, and it takes a bit to lay out and figure out. But once you have the marks in place, you can lay it out just like you cut the other ones. And cutting an angle is just like cutting anything else, so you're just following a line. You can see how that one is a really weird angle. I used a spoke shave to feather out the transition from the rest of the block to the wedge that I created, just making it a little easier to work around. And now I have this big honking thing that I can stick in there and play with and take it back and forth, test it, and do it. The only way to do this is trial and error. Clean it up, put it in, clean it up, put it in, clean it up, keep trying it until it goes, until eventually you realize, oops, I took off a little bit too much there, I should not have done that. So let's go on to wedge number 3. And this one I'm going to do cherry because I ran out of the live oak on a size big enough. So this is a lot larger piece. And I'm taking the angles from the actual plane as well as the drawing so that I can make sure that I'm fitting what is in reality, not just what is on the drawing, because that is one of the hardest things. You are a human and you've made mistakes, so what you created isn't exactly what the drawing is, so it's better to take it off of reality. In this case, I'm making those 3 cuts down, the 2 sides parallel, and then the third side, which is the angle for the wedge. cut off the excess chunks and then clean out the shoulders a little bit so that it smooths from the wedge to the rest of this block. It just makes it easier to be able to clamp the rest of this block on, and everything goes together. So here I can actually test it and see, does it fit? And in this case, ooh, I was actually really happy. This one was very close. It's not going to take that much to clean it up. I'm just going to use a hatchet to take off the excess at the base here, just making it easier to get planes and spoke shades in. I use a spoke shade to take off a lot of material. When I see that I've got a pile to remove off, I had to bring the wedge back down almost an 1/8 inch. And I can plane it down to make sure it's nice and flat. And I'm going to come at it with files and rasps to do the final dimensioning and bringing it to size. And so I'll file it for a little bit, and then I'll test it, slide the plane on, see where I need to remove a little more material, where I've removed too much, and go back at it again. Do it very carefully and very slowly. A little bit with the file, test it, a little bit with the file, test it. Don't work at it too much. And eventually you'll get the wedge that will come all the way through, have a nice clean fit. And now it makes it very easy to then cut off the excess, and now we have a wedge ready to do some testing. I'm not going to do the detail on the other end of the wedge until we're done. So here you can see my first one, my second one, and then the third one that finally works. A bit of learning along the way, and it's been a fun task. Now the next thing I need to do is drill a hole through the side, because in a spill plane the chips do not come out the top. They actually come out a hole in the side. And right here is the problem. I put the hole about a 1/4 inch too far forward. And this hole needs to be drilled through, matching the angle of the iron, but parallel with the bottom and top of the plane. Drill through one side and through the wedge, so that the wedge actually has this scooped shape that then forms the chip. And so the wedge is integral to this part, not only with holding the iron in place, but actually creating the curl as it comes out. And here I noticed I'm way too far away. You can see I should have had it come all the way back to the iron. So I tried filing it, I tried carving it back, and in the end the hole was just too big. It wasn't small enough to actually form the chip the way it was supposed to. Once I had the injection hole cleaned, and then I could put the wedge back in and see how much more I needed to do on the wedge. And normally it was just a little bit of a file cleanup here if you did it right, but in this case I didn't, and it was way too far forward. So I can cut off the excess on the tip of this so that the wedge doesn't protrude out the sole. It's just inside the sole by a 1/16 inch or so. And then with the wedge in place, I can carve it into shape and then come back with a rat tail file and actually shape out what the curl would run on. And this time I was still hoping maybe I can salvage this. As you can see, I took a large chunk off the front tip of this, and that chunk is needed to form the curl, because the curl kept jamming at that point. And so once I got as close as I could, it was time to actually test this thing. And so it's a lot of tapping it back and forth, making sure that the iron is sticking out just enough, not too far. It's a very temperamental thing, because this is a very difficult thing. You're making the curl. The curl is the important item. That was the first pass of it, and I was actually kind of impressed. I thought, ooh, maybe this will work. We'll have to give this another shot. And after playing with it back and forth, either the chips would just jam in the mouth because the curl wasn't being formed correctly, or they just weren't shaping out right. And some of them, like that one, actually came out somewhat well, and every now and then a chip would work, but most of the time, oops, oh well.
So there you have it. This is a really fun one, and I'm wanting to do this again because it is a great mental game, especially with the weird angles on the wedge and making everything fit up. It's a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to doing it again next time. So if anyone has any ideas, comments, let me know down below. I'd love to read those. If you like this type of video, please let me know that as well. And I'm looking forward to next time using the Red Rose production kit to make one a little bit better. So I think that's about it for today, and until next time, have a wonderful day. As you can see, my bench is a mess, and this is a mess up.